Okay, we're going to get started. Welcome, everyone, and thanks for coming. Our speaker today is Dr. Bryce Reeve, someone I've had the pleasure of working with for about 7 years now. Dr. Reeve is down the hill at that other establishment and has braved the atmosphere to come up and share his experience with us. Bryce is Associate Professor in the Department of Health Policy and Management at the Gilling School of Global Public Health at Chapel Hill. He's also a member of the UNC Lineberger Comprehensive Cancer Center. And from 2000 to 2010, he was an Outcomes Researcher and Program Director at the National Cancer Institute. It was through Bryce's work at NCI that the Promise Network, you might have seen a recent awesome presentation about the Promise Network, developed. And Bryce, I think, was the only psychometrician in the federal government for, or at least the NIH, and now there are none.
Yeah,
so, yeah, anyway, that's bad in a way, but it's good for us because now Bryce is an investigator and a potential colleague. And one of the reasons why we invited him to come and present today was because some of the work he's doing in patient-reported adverse event reporting in cancer is something we could consider adapting to other therapeutic areas here at the DCRI. So I think, I should also note, because Bryce is important in many ways, that he was recently elected President of the International Society of Quality of Life Research and serves on NCI's Symptom Management and Health-Related Quality of Life Steering Committee and CLGB's Health Outcomes Committee. And he's an advisor for the European Organization for Research and Treatment of Cancer. So there we go. So here's Bryce.
Thank you, Kevin. Good afternoon, everyone. Hello. All right. Come on, Gladys. Show me that light that Duke has. Rabid fans. When I scheduled this months and months ago, I never really placed it in reference to the conference itself. And had I known the result, I'm not sure if I would have planned to be here today. But I am a diehard true Car Hill fan, so I'll manage to make it through, even despite the wall hangings in this room. So. All right, so thank you. I want to appreciate Kevin for inviting me to be here today, and thank you, DCRI, for letting me talk to you. And as Kevin noted here, I'd be very interested in thinking about unique ways, given the incredible infrastructure that the DCRI has in terms of running multi-site, multinational, international trials here, is to figure out ways that we can help work together and perhaps think of unique ways. For the topic today is trying to integrate patient experiences and perspectives in terms of rate of monitoring and grading adverse events in clinical trials. And so hopefully today I'll stimulate some interest among the group on ways, and perhaps after the meeting today in follow-up meetings and conference calls, we can talk about ways perhaps we can work further to enhance and expand this area of research. The first part of my talk, I'll hopefully provide a groundwork or justification for why we think that integrating the patient's direct voice into adverse event monitoring will help enhance the efficiency, precision, and validity of adverse event reporting. Then I'll talk specifically about the PRO-CT project, which is a project I initially started at the National Cancer Institute, and will be sort of the foundation for how we see of directly integrating the patient's voice in adverse event reporting. And so a lot of this will be a material you probably already know, but the National Cancer Institute defines adverse events as any unfavorable and unintended sign, symptom, or disease temporarily associated with use of a medical treatment or procedure that may and also may not be considered related to the medical treatment or procedure. The FDA requires or mandates that adverse event in both pre-marketing and post-marketing reporting of adverse events by sponsors themselves. So it's a federal requirement to monitor and track adverse events. adverse events and the source for the adverse event data is not specified at all. So there is no mandate about where that adverse event data comes from, whether it be clinicians, laboratories, or from patients themselves. And so there are different sort of adverse events data that we report to the FDA and to the NCI, and they come from different data sources. We collect laboratory values such as neutrophil count decreased, which comes from laboratory results. We have events such as hospitalizations and deaths, which we can get from administrative claims data. We also capture clinical measurements such as retinal tears, which are done by clinical staff. And in the last row, the area where I'm focusing my attention of my presentation today on are symptoms, our patient experience symptoms. And again, the common source of data for collecting symptom data are clinicians themselves, are the ones who are grading and reporting symptoms experienced by patients. And so it is this last row, this last data source, we're in question today whether we can integrate patient reports as a source of data for symptom measures. As you know, adverse event monitoring is an essential activity in treatment trials. Is to make sure the patients are safe, that there are no harmful effects for the patients within a clinical trial. And it's also, we collect adverse event data to provide data about how the drug affects the patient lives. And this information together is useful for multiple stakeholders. Of course, the sponsors collect this data and report it to the regulators. Clinicians use the information to make treatment decisions. And of course, this is most important for patients to understand what they may expect when they go under a certain treatment. Obviously, the data we collect from adverse event monitoring populates our adverse reactions section of our drug labels. We all take medications, I'm sure. And when you look at the drug label, you see a long list of perhaps adverse events. On now these commercials for erectile dysfunction, it takes them 5 minutes to go through all the possible adverse events associated with it. So we're familiar with hearing these things as patients ourselves. Here is the drug label for docetaxel, which is a chemotherapy agent. And what I've noted here in red boxes here are those adverse events in the drug label that are symptom experiences. From the top, epistaxis. You know, I should say here is, you'll notice during the talk today, I'm not a clinician. I have no clinical background. I'm a measurement person. And so these words are very foreign to me. So I said, what the heck is epistaxis? Then I looked up, it was nosebleeds. I said, well, what the hell did it say nosebleeds instead of coming up with some language to make me look stupid? So anyways, and so what I try to highlight here again are those where we think patients are perhaps in the best position to report on these type of symptoms. And in a study that looked across different drug labels in cancer agents and drugs, they found about 45% of adverse reactions listed in cancer drug labels are symptoms. And also, in terms of the activity of collecting adverse event data, this is actually not routinely different from what's typically done in routine oncology cancer care. Often, doctors interview and clinicians interview their patients. They ask them, how are you feeling today? Is there anything experiencing wrong? Are you experiencing any pain? So in your review of systems, which is what physicians do, this is almost the same type of nature of what we're doing at adverse event collecting. So what we're collecting in terms of symptom data here is not too different from the typical clinical visit that patients receive. I have these two pictures here, and I apologize that you can see little words over this picture here. I was trying to find in Google Images a picture where a doctor is listening to a patient talk. Do you know how difficult it is to find a picture of a doctor listening to a patient? Most of the time, there are pictures like this where the doctor is telling the patient what to do. And that constitutes 80% of the pictures I found. The other were pictures of, let's see, the doctor in a more of an authoritative stance, looking down among the patient themselves. Then I really found a really good picture of the doctor listening to the patient. And he does look like he's listening to him, but you can see the pen's not even on the paper. It's like, yeah, I'm listening to you, but I'm not writing this down. I don't care what you think. So anyway, so I apologize for that. That's a little side joke, sorry. So, and obviously we use information in adverse events, obviously to look, and hopefully what the FDA and what sponsors are looking for is to try to prove there's some treatment benefit for their particular drug. And so a treatment benefit is defined as the impact of treatment on how a patient survives, feels, or functions. And a treatment benefit can be measured in different ways. We can think of treatment benefit as the comparative efficacy of a drug. This is where perhaps the symptom is a primary or secondary endpoint. And so we're looking at such things as an improvement or delay in the development of symptoms or decrements in function compared to a placebo or active comparator. The area that I'm interested in talking about today is use of symptoms for assessing comparative safety, where we can look at reduction or delay in treatment-related toxicity compared to a placebo or an active comparator. For either comparative efficacy or safety, a drug company might make claims about their particular drug in relation to the alternative. So the question is, what I've been noting here, is again, for issues of comparative safety for adverse event data, it is the clinician who is collecting and reporting the toxicities and adverse events. And so the question is, who really is the best source for reporting symptoms? Well, the FDA released a guidance in 2009 where they say if the patient is in the best position to report on his or her symptoms in the setting of making efficacy claims. And so we recognize that the patient is the gold standard for reporting their symptoms. And so what we have now is a challenge here, is in the setting of efficacy claims, it is found that patients are the gold standard, are the ones who should be reporting their symptoms. This is what the FDA has said. But for some reason now, there's a double standard here. But in the area of adverse event data collection, it is the clinicians that are reporting this safety data. So why do we have this double standard? Well, there's been a number of different research studies that have looked at how patients and clinicians compare to each other in terms of collecting symptom results. And what they found over different types of research studies and clinical trials and observational studies is compared to patients' reporting of symptoms, clinicians tend to underreport the number of symptoms, the severity of symptoms, as well as the duration of symptom experiences. And this is not only in cancer, but across different disease settings. A study that was led by Dr. Ethan Bosch at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. And what he did was in about close to 500 patients, cancer patients with breast, lung, GU or GYN cancers, they're looking at the cumulative incidence of moderate severity adverse events over time. And what we see here in these pictures here is the patient's report, the cumulative incidence of moderate severity of adverse events are in red, and the patient reports in blue. This top left here is in, actually I have a pointer. So this is the patient in red, the physician in blue. We have fatigue, appetite loss, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and constipation. And in all instances, we find that the number of frequency of reporting adverse events is less for the physicians compared to the patients themselves. In the same study, Dr. Bosch compared the patients' reporting of their symptoms experience related to their overall health status as measured by the EQ-5D, and found again the patients are in red and the physicians are in blue. This is level or correspondence with overall health status from 0 to 1, where this is a perfect agreement or correlations or associations here. And again, you find for all 7 symptoms there that the patient's reporting of the symptom experience is more correlated or related to their overall health status. A study published in 2004 by Dr. Fromm et al. What he did in a phase 2 trial of weekly calcitriol, is that how you pronounce it? I hear no differences, and docetaxel in 37 men with metastatic prostate cancer. And in this study, what they measured was when patients reporting a symptom had changed by 10 points on the quality of life scale. The quality of life scale they used was the European Organization for Research, Treatment, and Cancer, ERTC, the Quality of Life Questionnaire, C30. And they have found that a meaningful, important change or difference on their score of 10 is a meaningful change by the patient's perception and is informative for making changes in the care of a patient themselves. And so what Dr. Fromm did is based on a 10-point change in their symptoms test that has been sustained for 4 weeks. So the patient has seen that doctor on multiple occasions over the 4 weeks, where the physician also able to detect the same symptom the patient reported. And what they found is on the bar, 100% that what they found is you can see the different percentages associated with each symptom in terms of when the physician either missed it in white or identified the particular symptom in the dark color there. And you can see for especially the symptoms of pain, dyspnea, insomnia, and anorexia, there was a huge discrepancy than what the patient's report identified versus what the physician has identified as well. Oop. Here we go. Now, also the question is, well, you know, we know that there's differences between patients and clinicians, but if we hold to the fact that clinicians are in the best position to report symptom adverse events, is there consistency among physicians in terms of rating patient symptoms? And so Dr. Bosch Dr. Ethan Bosch and Memorial Sloan Kettering did a study where they had 2 different clinicians go, in a chemotherapy suite go in and visit the patient 15 minutes later. And they're looking at when the physicians were in agreement about the toxicity or adverse event the patient experiences. ICCs are interclass correlations. You can think of them as correlations themselves, with 1 being perfect agreement, 0 being absolutely horrible agreement. And again, you see that even the physicians in rating the same patients there are unreliable in terms of identifying the appropriate symptom or adverse event. They did best, looks like, for neuropathy. Most of the times, when we start looking at differences between patients and physicians, reporting adverse events, a lot of the more subjective areas of symptoms are where we see greater discrepancy. For example, fatigue and depression and nausea. There's a more disagreement. In areas for more observable things like pain and vomiting is where you see more agreement. I'm surprised to see that the vomiting is so different among the physicians in this rating here. And so, what is the current process for how we collect and report adverse events? And I know you all are experts at it here, so perhaps you can tell the story better than I can. But the typical model across the country is that the patient obviously the patient under a clinical trial experiences a certain symptom. During the clinical interview, the clinician will talk to the patient and interpret the symptom. They'll write the symptom down, experience down in a chart. And then a data manager later on goes and abstracts the chart and converts the finding to standard terminology. And then finally, the results are published, are put into some type of research database for adverse event reporting. And there might be times when there's expedited adverse event reporting as well if it's a serious symptom. So the question is why do we see these differences in experiences, differences in reporting between what physicians report and what patients report? And I think there are a number of opportunities where there might be a breakdown in communication or in reporting itself. During the actual clinical interview, without some type of standardized form, some physicians will ask patients 1 or 2 symptoms, but might be waiting for the patient to tell them, so the patient themselves may not know to report a particular symptom unless directly asked. So what we need is a more standardized way of collecting this symptom data from patients using different types of questionnaires. And also, clinicians might be writing down the symptom experiences forms in different ways in the medical chart, which might be difficult for data managers to abstract and report in the database. For example, some do use the review of systems, and you can see here this physician sort of did a straight line of all the adverse events there. So this is, in some way, this data is represented in medical charts. A lot of different ways are just text in the chart where the data manager has to go through and flesh out and identify what the symptom is and what the appropriate grading should be. What we see in this actual medical record here, I took out the identifiable information, where it says the patient reports constipation while taking drug. The patient denies nausea or vomiting. Patient denies significant chest pain or lower extremity edema. Not sure if the patient has mild chest pain. Well, why didn't you ask? I don't know. And the patient does note that patient has some mild fatigue. And again, this information has to be abstracted and imported in the medical chart. And so what we're offering through this research project is to have patient directing reporting of symptoms that go directly from the patient themselves straight down into the research database. And this information can be fed to the physician themselves. And so by doing this, we hope to improve adverse event data. We recognize that the physician obviously will be in the best position to assign attribution, and because they'll have the best experience to know exactly what might be caused by the drug or not. And there might be some instances where the patient provides some data, like, gee, I am experiencing some numbness or tingling in my hands or feet, but it's the physician that can actually note and diagnose that that's neuropathy. And obviously, if we're providing this patient direct information, the clinician has the opportunity to enhance the clinical care that the patient receives, so there's a reciprocal effect there. And so what we're trying to develop here and identify is there's a strong need to enhance the precision, validity, and timeliness of adverse event reporting by directly integrating the patient's voice. And that's what sets us up to develop the patient-reported outcome version of the common terminology criteria in adverse event. And so in 2008, the National Cancer Institute issued out a request for proposals to issue a contract to develop the patient-reported versions of the CTCAE with the goal to employ rigorous scientific methods to create a system for patient self-reporting of adverse symptoms in cancer trials, which is widely accepted and used, generates useful data for investigators, regulators, clinicians, and patients, and is compatible with existing adverse event reporting systems that the NCI uses. For those who are not familiar with the CTCAE, again, it stands for the Common Terminology Criteria for Adverse Events. This is an adverse event system that was developed by the National Cancer Institute, and it's in version 4. The version 4 is the CTCAE serves as sort of a lexicon or dictionary for how adverse events are detected and graded for NCI-sponsored clinical trials. The CTCAE is used by all the cooperative groups that NCI supports. It's used by many other oncology trials outside of academic research centers, and it's also used throughout Europe and Canada and through Asian countries like Japan. So it is used internationally as well. Version 4 of the CTCAE, which was just published in 2009, is actually linked to MEDRA itself, the Medical Dictionary for Regulatory Affairs. And so we can directly link each of the terms in CTCAE to the MEDRA database itself. Within the CTCAE, it's identified over 1,000 different types of adverse events that a patient can experience. And again, that constitutes different diseases, lab reports, clinical endpoints, as well as symptoms themselves. And the adverse events are graded on a scale from 1 to 5, with 1 being very mild symptoms, to 5, which is ultimately death of the patient themselves. Here are typical, I pulled out a few of the symptom items from the CTCAE. And in the top left here is mucositis. And you can see a grade 1 toxicity is identified as asymptomatic or mild symptoms, intervention not indicated. A grade 2 for mucositis is moderate pain but not interfering with functioning or oral intake. Grade 3, severe pain interfering with oral intake. And grade 4, life-threatening consequences, urgent intervention indicated. Below is headache. Grade 1 is a mild pain. Grade 2 is a moderate pain, but limiting instrumental activity of daily living, like going to work, going shopping, and other things like that. Grade 3 is severe pain and limiting self-care of activities of daily living. And what you'll see here is, especially between grade 2 and grade 3, is often when a decision needs to be made to either change the treatment for the patient themselves or to perhaps remove the patient from the study itself. And so it's very important to be able to differentiate a grade 1, grade 2, and especially from a grade 3 and grade 4. Here's anxiety from the nervous disorders. From the psychological disorders organ class. Grade 1 is mild symptoms, intervention not indicated. Grade 2, moderate symptoms, limiting instrumental activity, daily living. Grade 3, severe symptoms. And grade 4, life-threatening hospitalization indicated. And then finally, I show here urinary incontinence. We have occasional leakage with coughing and sneezing. Spontaneous pads is grade 2 indicated, limiting instrumental activity, daily living. And grade 3 is intervention indicated for urinary incontinence. I didn't show grade 5 up here. Again, that indicates the patient died because of that symptom. So, and again, the National Cancer Institute initiated a contract to develop, design, and test the patient-reported versions of the CTCAE. And the contract was awarded, you'll hear it, this is the third time you heard his name, to Dr. Ethan Bosch at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. Dr. Bosch is an oncologist there. And so they are the coordinating center for the contract itself. It has 5 different research sites, including Duke University is one of the sites participating in the development and testing. Amy Abernathy is the PI for the Duke site testing. Includes Dana Farber, MD Anderson, Mayo, as well as University of Pennsylvania. Because it is and I should say the technology site is Semantic Bits, and they have developed a number of different software systems for the NCI to help reform the clinical trials infrastructure. Because it is a contract, it's not like a grant where in the grant the investors go off and sort of do the work by themselves and report back to the funding agency, the NIH. The NCI, because this is a high priority project for the NCI, they are very much involved in the design and testing of the CTCAE system because all products developed under this contract is owned by the National Cancer Institute. The questionnaires and the software system are owned by the NCI. Because of that, they wanted to make sure that they make this system available widely to all interested researchers and especially their cooperative groups. And so because of that, the NCI is directly involved in the development of this questionnaire. Includes multiple divisions, cancer control and population sciences, cancer prevention, division for cancer treatment and diagnosis, as well as the Center for Bioinformatics and Technology. They also include advisors to the project, including members from the cooperative groups, the FDA, industry, as well as patient advocates. And also, on top of that, what we're concerned about is if we're designing and testing this system in your large academic cancer comprehensive research centers here, how do we know how well the system will work in community-based hospitals and clinic settings? And so we also added on 5 different community hospitals that participate in the National Community Cancer Center program as well. So I'll make sure I'm on time. Okay, good. And so there are multiple steps in this. There's 2 contracts to help support the development and evaluation of the system here. And so I've outlined 6 steps here. The first step is identifying what are the issues and challenges for implementing a patient-reported version of CTCAE, and I'll go through our results in a moment. Step 2 is obviously designing the patient questionnaire and doing cognitive testing to evaluate how well patients can understand the questions asked of them. Step 3, designing that web interface for both patients and clinicians and investigators and doing usability testing of the system. Step 4, validating the questionnaire in a standalone longitudinal study. Step 5, assess the feasibility and costs of the system to be used in our cooperative group trials. And since I worked for NCI, I still think I worked there at times, so that's why I say R. Step 6 is doing actually a randomized trial to look at the value of PRO for informing and enhancing adverse event monitoring in the cooperative group trial setting. So in terms of some progress to date, we have, as Deb Bruner at the University of Pennsylvania led a study, a survey of the key stakeholders that would be involved in implementing and using PRO CTCAE data. And so this survey was administered to representatives from the federal government, including the NCI and the FDA, included the cooperative group leadership from all 12 cooperative groups, but now those have shrunk down drastically to about 3 or 4. But this is before we had originally our 12 cooperative groups, including the group leadership as well as the group membership. They interviewed PIs, investigators, CRAs, nurses, advocates, and representatives from industry itself. The paper is in the process of getting published, but in terms of some of the findings, not surprisingly, we found that there was almost a large agreement, above 80%, that especially in adverse events, that symptomatic adverse events should be reported by patients themselves, and that we should collect PROs in clinical trials from patients themselves. As well as they think that patient-reported adverse events should be reported in clinical trial results and in drug labels. About 76% agreed with that statement. Obviously, there's a number of barriers to implementing this type of system in our clinical trials. Among those would be how people with severe illness, perhaps ECOG status of 3 or larger, those who are very ill or have cognitive issues, being able to provide this patient data. In those instances, 70% of the people said that we could use a caregiver proxy reporting should be permitted. Obviously, another sort of obstacle, especially in our community hospitals, is lack of computers. Concern about limited time. When are we going to have this extra 10 or 15 minutes for patients to report their symptoms? Personnel, lack of personnel to help make sure and oversee the questionnaires given to the patient and collected from the patient, as well as limited clinic space to give patients the privacy to report their symptom data. A number of solutions were looked at, and obviously everyone says we need more money. Yeah, anything can be fixed with more money, and so the NCI recognizes that, of course. Sites need new computers. Site did note that they had clinical staff who could assist with patients, about 66%. Only about 58% of the sites could use wireless computers, are feasible at their site. And without access to computers, 88% they said they could use paper-based questionnaires. Designing the questionnaire. So a number of investigators, including myself, went through all those 1,000 CTCAE terms to identify which of those adverse event terms would be amenable to patient reporting, that where the patient can provide either some or all the information about that particular experience. And from that, we identified about 81 different symptoms from the CTCAE that we thought we could develop questionnaires to help enhance the adverse event reporting. The next step was to take very complex medical jargon and try to find ways to take a patient-reported equivalent that would be easy for patients to understand. And so we went out to existing questionnaires that are used with patients and did sort of a literature review as well to identify what are the most common terms where we think we could identify a particular adverse event. So, for example, for neuropathy, most questionnaires use the terms of numbness or tingling in the hands or feet for the patient questionnaire. For dyspnea, obviously, the question asks about their shortness of breath. And so, along with identifying not only patient terms to be associated with the complex medical jargon, we also try to identify, what do we want to learn about the symptom experience itself? What attributes of the symptom would be informative to help inform the grading of the toxicity? And so we identified a number of attributes. We identified that it might be helpful for different types of symptoms to understand how frequent they experience the symptom, how severe the symptom is, how the symptom interferes with their daily activity, perhaps the presence of a symptom like a rash or not, or the amount of a symptom like amount of vomiting and so on. And for every single symptom of the 81 symptoms we identified, each of those has a set of questions that tap into each of those attributes. For some questions like rash, it might simply ask, do you have a rash or not? That has one question. But for something, an attribute like anxiety, it might have three questions associated with it. How often did you feel anxious over the past week? How severe was your anxiety? And how did your anxiety interfere with your usual daily activity? So that had three questions at the most assigned to that particular symptom. For each attribute type, we developed a generic question structure, a standardized generic question structure to be used throughout all the questions based on, again, our review of existing questionnaires and input from experts who design surveys. We wanted to have a simplified grading scale for patients to be able to understand and use. We wanted to make sure the questions were clear to patients from diverse ethnicities, as well as patients who have different levels of education, especially low levels of education. And we wanted to make sure the language we use were amenable to translation into different languages. And so for each of the attributes I listed here, from frequency all the way down to presence or non-present, is we designed a standardized question structure. For frequency, it's in the last recall period. How often did you have this particular symptom? And it has 5 response categories from never to almost constantly. For severity, in the last recall period, what was the severity of your symptom at its worst? I should note here is what makes this severity questions different from your traditional questionnaires like PROMIS is that it's focused, because this is adverse event recording, monitoring, is we're always interested in the worst experience of the symptom as opposed to our average experience of a particular symptom over the reference period. Interference, how the symptom interfered with their usual activities, amount, as well as presence. And so what I show you here is how we took the CTCAE term myalgia and broke it down into its relevant pro-CTCAE items. And so at the top here is the actual CTCAE term and its associated grades in the CTCAE. Grade 1 is a mild pain. Grade 2, moderate pain, limiting instrumental activity of daily living. And Grade 3, severe pain, limiting self-care activities of daily living. And so this particular term has 3 questions associated with it. The first question we typically we ask is the frequency question. In the past 7 days, how often did you have aching muscles? If the patient answers never in our system, that skips to the next symptom. However, if they answer rarely or any of the other response options, it then goes on to the second question, which asks, in the past 7 days, what was the worst severity of your aching muscles at their worst? And then finally, how much did the aching muscles interfere with your usual activities in the past 7 days? So some immediate things jump out at you as you look at the way we've asked these questions. We've actually departed from the standard approach that the CTCAE takes. One is, we departed from the conventional way, is we've actually included a 7-day reference period. The traditional CTCAE, when clinicians administer it and record it, is the reference period is often based on the last time they saw the patient at the last clinic visit. However, we recognize that that clinic visit could have occurred 1 week, 2 weeks, a month ago, or a few months ago. What we have realized in the area of symptom research here is that patients are best able to recall their symptom over the past 7 days. And so that's why we sort of reinforce that patients can reliably measure the symptoms in the past 7 days. And also, what you'll notice here is in the grading in the CTCAE, they have mixed both severity of a particular adverse event, such as myalgia, and they've included interference in the same grading. We have split up our questions to ask about frequency, symptom severity, and interference in 3 different questions to enrich our ability to characterize the adverse event experience. This allows us in our reporting to perhaps for something like nausea, we can differentiate whether the nausea was extreme but infrequent versus the nausea that was mild but occurred over many, many days throughout the week. I sort of said that. We also then conducted cognitive interviews. Where we went out and with over 100 patients and people of low education to make sure they could understand the items administered to them. Through our cognitive interviews, which we've completed, we had to make some adjustments to some of the terms we used and some of the way we structured the questionnaire. Broadly, one of our broad findings was that patients don't really even look at the 7-day reference period. Sometimes they'll think of these symptoms experienced within the past day or the past 2 weeks or the past month. We tried to refine the instructions themselves. However, we also recognize that we're comfortable that patients use sometimes a different reference period, even though it's directly in the question itself. Because the fact is, this system here is for being able to identify as a signal if something is going on in this patient's lives. And so as a screening tool itself, we're comfortable that patients use a different reference period, even though we directly integrate 7-day recall. We've designed a web platform that has multiple interfaces for the clinician and the investigator to help design the questionnaire, for the patient interface where they can take the questionnaire, as well as for administrative interface itself. For the investigator clinician, our Pro CTCAE system allows them, like you do with any case report form, to design the questionnaire yourself. And so because it's the investigator clinician that identifies which of these symptoms over here, these are the CTCAE terms over here, and on the right here is the actual case report form that's being developed here. And as a clinician clicks on any of the symptoms over here, the adverse events from CTCAE, such as difficulty sleeping, that will automatically send it over into the case report form. It has a scheduling system to allow investigators to administer the questionnaire at different times within the different chemotherapy cycles or whatever, under what treatment regimen the patient's on. For the patient interface, all they get are the questions themselves and response categories. The question asks, what's the severity of your watery eyes or tearing at their worst? They answered mild, which is a conditional question. Since they answered mild, they get the second question. If they answered none, they go on to the next question, which asks them how their watery eyes interfered with usual daily activities. So this is what the patient sees. There's a progress bar up here of how far they are through the questionnaire. At the end of the questionnaire, remember the questions that are administered to patients are the one the investigators or clinicians have added to the case report form. Well, how do we know that there's another symptom the patient is experiencing but was not part of the questionnaire? And so at the end of the questionnaire, the patient comes to sort of the last page, which is almost like a symptom checklist. And these symptoms up top are the most common type of symptoms that patients experience, and ask, gee, have you experienced any of these other symptoms? And they can go through and click on anxiety or dry mouth or mouth sores or rash. And then that will automatically lead to a set of questions on those particular symptoms the patient asks. We also have a fill-in-the-box text where the patient can fill in. If they don't see anything else up there, but they are experiencing some type of symptom, is they can fill in here. And this is like fillable, like what you do in Google. As you start typing in, it fills it in and links it to measured terms. There are individual reports based on the patients themselves that the clinician or the investigator can look at. And then this report, it orders the patient's responses to the symptoms by date of completion by clinic visit and highlights in red those symptoms that have gone past some certain threshold. The investigator can look at study reports that aggregate across the patients in their trial. Also, this system has the ability to send automated alerts to site staff through emails or other types of communications the physician or investigator wants. And so this will send a text message or to a cell phone as well. And so this sends an automated alert that this patient with identifying information here, contact information, the site of the hospital, and it lists which symptoms prompted the alert itself. And if severe enough, this can obviously result in an expedited adverse event report. They are now starting to validate the questionnaire, and validation actually just started within the past couple months. And as part of the validation study, they want to assess the validity of the system, how well the system is able to differentiate among people at different cancer types, different severity, different treatments, reliability of the instrument, like test recall, how well the instrument performs in sensitivity across time. For patients undergoing treatment, how well does the system pick up differences in patient experience? As well as it's actually looking at how well that 7-day recall period compares to a 1-day versus a 2-week recall period. They'll be testing this in multiple patient populations undergoing chemotherapy or other types of radiation or other treatments. The sites are the same sites that I listed earlier, are 5 large comprehensive cancer centers, including Duke, as well as community hospitals participating in a National Community Cancer Center program. And that's currently, in step 5 here, is where they are in terms of the project itself. The next steps of the project after this is starting to go on now, is they want to assess is how feasible and what are the upfront and ongoing costs to implement this system in our cooperative group setting. And then finally, what they hope to test is do a randomized trial and look at how well the PRO CTCAE system helps inform and provide precision and validity in terms of the adverse event reporting. And they're going to be looking at different models in this trial where the patients report the data independent of the clinician and when they have a shared communication where the clinician can see what the patient reports and how that informs the adverse event grading and reporting. And so, in conclusion, is that we feel that patient reporting of adverse symptom events in clinical trials is not only is feasible and clinically valuable. We do think it will improve the validity, the quality, and efficiency of safety data collection. We think through our unique set of questions that we're going to get a better understanding of the symptom experience reported by patients. And we feel this system, because of this automated alert system here, can be more proactive to identify when a patient experiences a symptom and either provide better care for that patient or expedite adverse event reporting. We also recognize that this system has application beyond just your typical cancer cooperative group clinical trials itself. Most of our effort and focus has been on the pre-marketed studies, but also we can recognize that in post-market surveillance, you can use this adverse event symptom questionnaire in post-market surveillance to figure out how well patients in real-world settings are responding to the particular intervention. Obviously, if we start collecting these core symptoms using this system, the Pro-CTCAE, if everyone's collecting the same core symptoms using this system here, is we are developing an incredible database to do comparative effectiveness research. We can also see, again, because the parallel between what we're trying to capture in clinical trials is similar to clinical practice here, is we feel that it would be interesting to see is how well the system beyond the clinical trials enterprise helps inform and improve not only communication and decision making in clinical practice, as well as we see that we can expand this symptom monitoring system from cancer to other chronic diseases. Obviously, these symptoms like pain, fatigue, depression, nausea, vomiting, arthralgia, myalgia, all these symptoms here aren't specific to cancer themselves. These symptoms are also experienced in other chronic disease settings. In a study, we had two clinical investigators, two physicians, go through U.S.-approved drug labels for different types of diseases, breast cancer there, sorry about that, but including asthma, GERD, hyperlipidemia, as well as osteoarthritis there. They examined these drug labels there, identified the average adverse events per label, and symptom adverse events per label, and then how many were unique listed across all the labels that were identified for each of these conditions. And what we found here is almost half of adverse reaction in drug labels are symptoms themselves. So again, this lends to the credibility that we can apply this same type of system in other chronic disease settings. And hopefully, again, given the rich infrastructure that the DCRI has, is we can figure out ways to perhaps work together to start testing and expanding this to other disease settings. Since we've launched the Pro-CTCAE effort, obviously we've got a lot of interest from a number of different researchers, not only in the U.S. but internationally, that want to start using the Pro-CTCAE, translating it in different countries, and start testing it there. We've also received a lot of attention from industry itself that wants to pick up and use it in their clinical trials, as well as obviously there's your vendors out there that want to develop a new sort of bells and whistles version of the system as well. And so we think we're getting a lot of interest, and I think because this really taps into a different area of research, of survey development and use of PRO data than what's typically done for endpoint measures, for what measures like PROMIS is developed for. So I'll stop there. I'm happy to take any questions you have.
Thank you very much. Questions?
I have a question with DCRI Safety Surveillance. The question I have is about over-reporting. What we see in our daily life in adverse event reporting, that even the events are filtered through clinicians. We see a lot of sign and symptoms reported. So I'll give you an example of pneumonia. So it may be I have cough, grade 4, fever, grade 4, I have chest pain and shortness of breath. So we query them back and say, no, this is not right. Please just report the final diagnosis. So if you're reporting directly from patient, that filter is gone. So now you can have a lot of sign and symptoms. And you may have a diagnosis reported through physician. So aren't you over-reporting the same event, having many grade 4s, and it may impact the future IBs?
That's an excellent question, and one that's the most commonly asked question we receive, especially among pharmaceutical companies as well, is concerned that we're going to be over-reporting and making their drugs look bad themselves. Now, these are issues that I think that are open for research and something that we empirically want to test themselves. One of the statements I forgot to make, I'm kicking myself now for it. Unfortunately, I'm not flexible enough to kick myself yet, but one is that what we're developing here is not to replace clinician reporting of adverse events. And so what we're trying to do is collect data that would complement what's actually reported in the CTCAE or whatever system you induce for adverse events reporting. And so the data that our current model is that it's the current model that physicians are still the one who are going to be entering the adverse event and grading and entering the adverse event data. And so in our first sort of rollout of the system here is we're going to collect this patient data there, provide it to the clinician who would then ultimately make the grading in the CTCAE. And that's going to be our current model. This clinical trial I talked about here will actually be exploring that question you asked and seeing is there over-reporting, and so how well are there agreement and disagreement, and where we can find ways to complement the information for reporting in CTC. So it's an excellent question. It's something that there is concern about, but it's something that we'd like to empirically test before we make that statement itself.
Okay, I have next question. So do you have any plan to having event adjudicated at database level so people can see onset date and based on that make a diagnosis and not over-reporting the same event?
For what people to be able to see that, I'm sorry? The clinicians or the patients?
No, the data management.
Yes. So the data. Yes. So again, our current model is that the data the patient has is not going to automatically. It's going to be a grade 3 for the CTCAE. That data will be collected, and it's the data manager or clinician that will have access to that data and do the actual grading in the system itself. That's our current model.
Dr. Granger.
So this is a great, thanks. That was a really nice, thoughtful coverage of a new and kind of highly systematic approach. To follow up on this same general type of question, I would, many of us feel as though clinical research now, our main problem is we're overly complex. We need to kind of simplify things, focus on enrolling more patients, and focus on the key clinical outcomes that are really important. And of course, a concern here would be that asking patients about each one of these symptoms might create lots of additional information that's of relatively limited value in understanding the important outcomes regarding these treatments. You showed the lipid treatment, for example. Many of us believe that one of our biggest problems with statin use, for example, is that television ads list the complications that patients have. Patients come in and stop the drug and report those to us, when in fact, in the careful randomized clinical trials, generally the side effects are minimally different than placebo, and yet collection of all this information can sometimes have these negative consequences. Seems though this might be more relevant in early phase than in later phase trials to kind of define things that one might not understand about new drugs, but in later phase maybe I at least hope, and I'm sure you do, have people on your research groups who have the contrarian viewpoint, who have the viewpoint, prove to me that, you say clinically valuable, prove to me what you mean by clinically valuable, and that the additional information that's collected is actually of greater value than adding to complexity.
I agree 100% with your statement itself, and I think in many ways that there will be a lot of mild symptoms that will be picked up by the system here, but we have to recognize though that these are what the patient feels and experiences there. So it's important to capture that from the patient perspective there, and report that. And so when you go to these websites like People Like Me, patients love a lot because patients are able to list the treatment they're receiving and all the experiences, the symptoms they're experiencing there. And so other patients will say, gee, I'm feeling the same thing or not. But I recognize that that's outside the context of a randomized, controlled clinical trial there. And how do we know that's different from a placebo or any type of comparator? And so I think I agree with you. We need to be very cautious about how we try to report this patient data itself. And it has to come from those randomized controlled trials to understand whether this is something that all patients, placebo or the treatment group, are experiencing, or something that's uniquely different about this treatment. And again, we're trying to approach this in a very systematic way to help us gain an understanding how we can better use this information to inform grading and toxicity. Eventually, we'd like to see how this might be rolled out to improve perhaps drug labeling for patients themselves, but I think this is a long way down the road. We do have those people who have doubts about the system in place. Because this is NCI sponsored, up to the director himself has the same questions you did, as well as the people at FDA, and so we're trying to be conscious of that. That's an excellent point. I agree 100%.
Okay, well, I think that's time. Thank you again to Dr. Reeve for coming to talk to us about this.
Thank you. The last thing I forgot to note here, my last slide, is Ethan Bosch, New England Journal of Medicine 2010, published The Missing Voice of Patients in Drug Safety Reporting. I recommend reading that New England Journal of Medicine report. It sort of overviews everything I talked about today. Thank you.